Hello, everybody. Welcome to Just Some Podcast. I'm just some dude on the internet, and today I am met with my friend Joe. Say hello, Joe.
Hello.
So today's podcast episode is going to be a little bit different than the ones that you've heard in the past. This is the first episode that is being recorded, a live conversation between me and my guest in my home studio. Joe is so grateful I'm grateful that Joe is so gracious as to drive all the way here. So we're going to be having our podcast episode live in my studio, where in the past, when we've talked with my father, that had been, in a remote place. So you're going to hear less dog jingling as in barking and different sounds like that. We're in a more controlled environment, which is actually pretty good because I think that this is a good opportunity to have the conversation that we're going to talk about today. So today's episode is special because I feel like it's the first episode that really we'll dive into more of my background for the audience, and who better than to share this conversation with than you, Joe. So for the audience, I'm going to let you in on it. Today, we're going to be talking about religious trauma syndrome. It is going to be kind of at the center focus of our conversation, but I'll let Joe speak on his experience. But Joe is an ex-member of the LDS Mormon Church. I've walked away from Christianity myself, and I just recently heard this term, religious trauma syndrome, from my therapist of all people, who recommended, taking a look at this subject. So I looked in deeper and thought that you would be the perfect candidate to have this conversation. So first and foremost, have you ever heard of religious trauma syndrome, Joe?
No, not, religious trauma, yeah, but as a syndrome, I had no idea.
Yeah, it's important to point out, it's not a designated, it's like not in the DSM-5. So it is kind of like correlated with like PTSD, but it's not an official diagnosis of any kind there. But I did some research. We're going to try something different. The background for a lot of this reporting that I've got here, I've utilized some AI. So my audience has heard, we've done an episode on AI before. So the business, Just Some Content LLC, is now utilizing more artificial intelligence to research and prep these podcasts. So a lot of these sources that'll be included in the show links are going to be from research based on Claude. So just pulling that out now. So we're going to be talking about some statistics as it pertains to RTS, what we'll say, because religious trauma syndrome is kind of a mouthful. But all those stats kind of go back to some deep research with Claude. So I'll open this up by saying that religious trauma syndrome affects 27 to 33% of U.S. adults at some point in their lives. Now, that's like a big percentage of people. I would wager that, you go out on the street and you'll probably, the majority of people that you will interface with are probably religious in one sense or another in the United States. It's, not uncommon. But yet RTS remains largely misunderstood despite that percentage. All right. So this guide that we're going over is a framework for empathetic, accessible exploration of this RTS. And it's going to balance the psychological accuracy with human connection. And we're specifically designing this for an audience seeking understanding. So to open up, I know I probably should have said this sooner, content warning for this episode in particular. If ever there was an episode for a content warning, this is it. This conversation is going to include discussions of religious trauma, depression, possibly, anxiety, and faith crisis. There are some crisis resources available to you. So National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, 988, and there is the crisis text line 741-741. As well as some specialized resources, anyone in the audience, if you need it, the Religious Trauma Institute, Recovering from Religion, and the Reclamation Collective. Now with that, I will paint a picture really quick for the guests before we kind of dive into the rest of the conversation. So imagine spending your entire life believing that your thoughts, feelings, and very existence are fundamentally flawed, that questioning deeply held beliefs could damn you eternally, that leaving your community means losing everyone you love. For millions of Americans, this is not imagination. It's the lived reality of religious trauma. So we kind of need a core definition to speak on RTS, so that way we can kind of have more of our centered conversation. So religious trauma syndrome describes the psychological and emotional damage from exposure in controlling authoritarian religious environments. So it's first been coined by psychologist Dr. Marlene Winell in 2011. RTS encompasses both the trauma of living within harmful religious systems and the trauma of leaving them. So it's not necessarily just being in it, but trying to walk away. Does that seem like something that kind of resonates with you?
Absolutely.
And, before I even dive further into the RTS, do you mind giving the audience a little bit of background on you and your experience with religion? Like maybe like how long were you involved in the LDS community and how long have you been away from them?
Let's see. I suppose I was born in it and raised. I got baptized at 8 years old, and they say you're choosing to be baptized at that age. But of course, I didn't know anybody who didn't choose to do that. And then when you're 18, you're called to go on a mission for the church. And if you don't do that, it is socially suicidal, but socially quite awkward. All the women are taught that you need to marry a return missionary. So,
wow.
And to do that, you've got to have worthiness interviews and certain standards, such as abstaining from any sexual activity.
A worthiness interview.
Yeah.
Describe that situation. That sounds like it's kind of intense.
Yeah, and it was the kind of thing that when we're waiting for our interview with the bishop, who's always been a good guy. All my bishops have been really good guys. So I just want to say that. And they seem to really care, and they're doing the best they can in the system that they're in, But they will ask us questions, of a sexual nature to make sure you're not unclean, so to speak. And it's that kind of that kind of invasive questioning that is part of the trauma,
Yeah.
Your most private stuff is now, their business. And if you're deemed unworthy, then there are social consequences to that. If you don't go on a mission, for example, you're it's pretty taboo. Or partaking of the sacrament every week, you're supposed to abstain if the bishop tells you to, and that way everybody sees you not partake of the sacrament. I mean, there's like these ways to see,
Yeah.
Anyway, so I wouldn't say my parents were especially doctrinaire. They weren't especially strict. I would say they were kind of in the middle. But even in the middle, in this religion, is pretty strict.
Mm-hmm.
So, anyway, I was lucky. I got to serve my mission, a 2-year mission in Russia, in St. Petersburg, Russia. That's a fun cultural,
What year was that? The mission that you did? 95
and 96 and 97.
95, 96, 97.
For 2 years. And I met some people there that were interesting, and I almost wouldn't want to trade that experience. But anyway, I'm glad. So in that sense, I'm glad I went. But anyway, it was about, I guess we were around 40 years old that we started questioning the church. And it was what really prompted it.
At 40, you said?
Yeah.
Okay.
What prompted it for me is my son was approaching adolescence. He's getting old enough that he's soon going to be getting bishop's interviews. And when I thought of him getting bishop's interviews and hating himself for perfectly natural human actions, I knew I had to take a second look at the church, because now I wasn't just having a leap of faith for me. If I was wrong, then he'd be tortured needlessly, kind of like I was. So I took a really serious relooking at the church, and of course it didn't. When you step back and take a really honest look at it, it was a different story than when my whole life I'd been taught to give it every chance and what they call gain a testimony of the truthfulness of the church. You're pressured to make sure you gain that testimony and you learn that it's true. So
that sounds like a very structured and like I said, almost intense experience, especially for young men and women.
Mm-hmm.
You're trying to figure out your place in the world, and just from what you had said, like you're born into it. So similar situation for me. And I'm not from an LDS background. I'm from what I would just classify as Christian. I don't necessarily know the particular sect, but maybe like it was like Assembly of God, but I don't know where you would put that under. But I was raised in a church that had, you know, a lot of the older generation of people, and being told, you know, like Jesus is coming, you're going to see him in your lifetime, and, you know, just being made to believe, you know, from a very, very early age, going to Sunday school, listening to the stories. And I found that others, you know, that have left religion or, you know, didn't take religion as seriously, they would hear the stories and they go, oh, like these are just fables or, you know, lessons that I can apply to my life or whatever. But for me, you know, I wanted to believe, and I was raised in an environment that I was told that, you know, Jesus is very, very real. God is very, very real. You know, there are consequences for, you know, misbehaving in the eyes of God, and kind of created more of a sense of fear, I would say, for myself. And, you know, having your worldview shaped by fear is not a good thing, I would say. Like, that type of pressure wears on you after a period of time. So about the time, you know, that I was old enough, like around where you're saying like your son is, you know, you start asking a lot of questions, and, you know, you don't generally seem to get answers that you are seeking. They just lead to more questions. And I just want to touch for the audience as well. I know that the conversation surrounding religion is a very sensitive one. And I take the opinion, like I hold no judgment against those that follow a religion. I'm much more of the opinion that just as it is your right to follow a religion, it is my right to not follow a religion. And I ask that people respect that of me, just as I respect that of them. I'm not judging anybody for getting their sense of community, or, you know, feeling like I'm not trying to trash your ideals as a religion. There's plenty of good things that you can learn through different religions if you look at them under the microscope. But just for me, I felt, you know, if we're talking about lived experiences and what I have lived through, it felt for myself, and maybe yourself included, I'd like to hear your take, but that I kind of had to live my life in a box to fit what was expected of me. It was like, this is the picture of a good person, a godly man, you know, and that led to feelings of guilt and shame surrounding, you know, perfectly normal everyday things. And just kind of cycling through all of the things that I'm failing to live up to, and meeting the expectations, and kind of never feeling worthy. There's
got to be something I got to repent of.
Yeah, exactly. Or if it's something small, you know, that you kind of maybe have heard this expression, audience, don't make a mountain out of a molehill. You know, when you've got that religious pressure on you, and your worldview has been shaped by, this is very, very real, and there are consequences to your actions. Small things become major things, like telling a little white lie is, quote, the same as murder, you know, or whatever, you know, and you think to yourself as a child, you're like, how is that possible? What, you know, oh my God, I basically killed someone. I lied about something, you know? And that's just a trivial example, but that's kind of my experience in brief as we are kind of jumping into this. Something that is interesting about RTS. So now that we've kind of shared a little bit of our background, I'm going to talk and point out some key characteristics and some daily life manifestations, and we can kind of see how closely this aligns, right? And for the audience, I have been away from my religion since I was probably, I'd say like about 21 years old is when I had finally made that decision. So I'm coming up on like 7 years of processing time. I'm sorry, I got to fix my mic here. Coming up on about like 7 years worth of processing time and several years of therapy to try to kind of unpack and dissect this. You are, how long have you been out of the?
About 10 years, I guess.
About 10.
I was, mentally out 10 years ago, and physically out 5 years ago, I guess.
Okay.
For good.
Would you say that you're still, you know, kind of processing what it means to live a life without the church? And
yeah, it's just, trying to kind of just get over it at this point, but it's it's there. It's always just seems like it's there.
I'm curious from your perspective, do you feel like when you walked away from the church that you kind of had, I don't want to call it like an identity crisis, but like trying, like a period of mourning where you're trying to figure out who to be or how to be in a world where, you know, you're not tethered to the religious aspect?
Yeah, a little bit of that, a little bit of, well, what would I want if it was up to me, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But then you kind of think of with regret back at how you would have done some things differently. But you can't do that. But it does feel like you're robbed of something. So, anyway.
Okay. So some of the key characteristics here, we've already mentioned one of them, that it's not officially in the DSM-5, but it's clinically recognized as religion-induced post-traumatic stress disorder. It involves twofold trauma, so prolonged indoctrination abuse and trauma from leaving. It affects cognitive, emotional, functional, and social dimensions of life. The way that it manifests day to day, here are a couple of examples. Decision-making paralysis. So years of external authority can create inability to make independent choices. So that's kind of that thought of like, what would Jesus do? You know, or like, what has the church molded me to think and believe and respond in certain ways?
Yeah. What would Jesus do is always, what do we tell you to do? You know, because I've often thought of something to ask would be, what would the Pharisees do? You know,
Explain the Pharisees.
The Pharisees were always the real strict religious zealots in the days of Jesus, and he was always chewing them out and telling them, and he was always doing things that was kind of broke the law a little bit, you know, bent the law and did things and just stood up to him and said, "You guys are missing the point. You guys are so wrapped up in the strictness of it all," you know. So now when I think of what would Jesus do, I also think of, well, what would the Pharisees do? Because I don't want to do that, you know. So that's you think of what Jesus do, because you want to think of something that's loving and something righteous, so to speak, you know. And the righteousness what I consider righteous now, what I consider back then are different, you know, because of what they taught. So.
Yeah. That's interesting to think about the polar opposite of like, what would Jesus do, but what is the opposite? Because I don't want to, go into the other side. Some other daily life manifestations. So we just touched on that decision-making paralysis, but, and this is another one that we've mentioned, is that identity confusion. It's a profound loss of self when religious framework provides entire identity. And I think at least a large amount of people have probably met or seen, you know, one person that's like religion is their whole identity. They latch onto it. They go to not just every Sunday, but every Wednesday, maybe Tuesday, Thursday. Who knows? Like they're active members of their community. And when you walk away from that, you kind of have this confusing sense of self, like moment of, if I'm not there at the church, if I'm not, you know, involved in that community, what does it mean to be me? What interests do I want to pursue versus where has the church directed me is kind of, you know, something I think I have experienced in my life. Like, who do I want to be versus who do people tell me that I should be?
Yeah, it's funny. It could seem like a small thing, but one of the things that I really felt pressure from the church was my career. I never thought about, what do I want to do that I would enjoy doing? You know, I have the opportunity. What would I like to do? But with the church, there's this tremendous pressure to make sure you make enough money so your wife doesn't have to work. You know, and provide for your family, and you know, you pay tithing to the church, like 10% of your income anyway. So so that was kind of that's pressure there that I felt, you know. And it wasn't until later I thought, what if I wasn't thinking about, okay, what if it was different? What if it was, my consideration was like, I've got to make as much money as I can so I can have as many kids as I can so my wife doesn't have to work either. So what if I didn't have to think that way when I was in my early 20s and just thought, what would I like to do? for a living.
Yeah. What interests would I like to explore?
Yeah. It was just real pressure to especially when you serve a 2-year mission, and that bites 2 years out of your college days. So you're kind of in a little bit more of a hurry,
Yeah. So. Yeah. It sounds like a lot of pressure to have a lot of things figured out right away. And I'm curious from your perspective, how involved maybe the church was financially to try to be like, oh, like we will help you in your time of need or take care of you. Like, was there an aspect of that? Because I know that you would give your tithes and offerings and such.
When I was unemployed, they definitely helped pay for our bills a little bit. That couldn't last forever, and unfortunately, there's what they call bishop roulette. It depends on who your bishop is. What if he's a real strict guy who didn't want to help anyone out? Kind of stingy, so to speak, with the church's money. And what about another guy who's like, oh yeah, here's a check, and maybe he's a little too giving of the money, But so it's not necessarily consistent. But I do know that we were helped at the time we needed, and that's nice. Except for I paid a lot more tithing to the church than I ever got out of it, So anyway.
Yeah, no, it's interesting to think about like the tithing aspect. Just I have my own experience without getting like too much into it. When I was younger, being told, we're going to go to church, and already being the little kid that's like, oh, come on, like it's Sunday, I just want to stay home, I don't want to do this. I remember having, my little baggie of quarters or whatever, and being told that I had to give a certain percentage of it to the church. And as a child, I was like, what? Like, that makes no sense. This is mine. Like, why would I give it away? And kind of, I being led on to be like, come on, like it's the right thing to do. And, me still coming to the conclusion, no, like I don't want to do that. And it's like, well, then we're going to do it anyway.
God gave you that money. So he's just asking for 10% of it back. He gave you all of it. Yeah,
exactly. And I remember having thoughts of like, okay, well, like if I just pray, good things will happen. Or, if something bad is going on, which I have plenty of experiences I'll talk about later on with prayer. Let's keep going on the daily manifestation, because I feel like I could definitely go off on a tangent now. So we've already covered the decision-making paralysis, the identity confusion. Third one I think you'll find interesting is the hypervigilance. So constant alertness to spiritual or moral threats. Always on the lookout for the devil.
Yep. There's always something you might need to repent of, or you've got to be so careful, especially in the sexual aspect. It's funny when it comes to sins, that is ranked so high all the time.
Yeah.
Sin next to murder is what they say. So to us, it was always, okay, murder somebody, but the next worst thing you can do is a sexual sin, from sleeping with your girlfriend to masturbation. Mm-hmm. So all that is sexual sin, and it's sin next to murder. So thanks a lot. That really gives you a complex. So gives you something that you can fail at wonderfully so that you're always feeling guilty. You're always messing up, so to speak, and it's just the worst. It was just a nightmare. And there were times when I would be in mid-laugh and then remember that, I had touched myself 2 weeks ago, and just feel like shit,
Yeah, no, and that's a very real trauma to kind of experience and to think about in real time. Like, it might sound comical to an audience or members of an audience that have never been raised in a religious context like that, where, sexual thoughts and feelings are totally normal and acceptable or whatever. I'm right there with you, where more often than not, the older that I got and the more I paid attention in sermons and stuff like that, I just felt guilty all the time. I was like, I have hormones running through me. I'm thinking thoughts and like, oh, I gotta repent for these, or, I'm feeling bad about feeling things. And, who am I supposed to talk to about this? And, am I supposed to just converse with God and make it go away if I, just tap into being a little bit more religious and studious or whatever, like I can compartmentalize those things and tuck them away and not think about it. And it's interesting to think, comparatively, about other people that, you probably have seen, or the audience has probably seen, the Catholic Church has a history of priests and boys and bad decisions. And you wonder how much of that is kind of brought upon them from this immense pressure of, sex is a sin.
This makes me think that there's three kinds of people especially because you're in these interviews, you're asked these things explicitly. And what can happen is you'll have somebody who's going to lie. Who's going to lie? They don't think what they're doing is wrong, and they're not going to tell him that, and they just lie. So you get people who pass their interviews with flying colors because they're just lying. So you're developing that kind of person. And then you got the people who do confess the things they do, and then they're punished for it. They feel awful. And then you got the kinds that are either strong enough to not do those kind of things anyway. Okay, so those are very potentially the Pharisee type folks, And then you got the kind that are asexual, and or certain things aren't even a temptation for them anyway, so they can't understand what's the problem. So those are the kind of people that ends up going on to. So you got the ones who actually move on are the ones who are either lying, or they're Pharisees, or they don't even have a problem. So why are you having a problem?
Yeah.
So, and you got the people who are doing their best and really trying hard, but then they fail at normal behavior, feeling horrible and just hating themselves. Anyway.
Yeah, no, and I hope that paints a picture for members of the audience that it is an intense thing to experience and to live with. It might sound intense on the outside, but imagine that this is reinforced by decades of, going to church and being told and taught to believe and repent, and it's a cycle. The last two of the daily manifestations before moving forward are relationship difficulties, so damaged trust and underdeveloped social skills, as well as that fear-based living, that persistent anxiety about divine punishment or spiritual consequences. I definitely, I drank some Red Bull. I definitely feel that I relate to that fear-based living of, there's this constant anxiety of there is an eye in the sky and it is watching me and it knows everything that I'm thinking. And then you start to kind of question, you're like, well, if God gives me free will and I make these choices, where is his hand in it? And you don't think that much.
Didn't he create me to like this thing? Yeah. And so I feel,
And those relationship difficulties, I'll even speak for myself. My very first relationship lasted about 3 years. It was from the time I was 15 to 18. And, that's an environment in which, I was very, very much a believer. And so was my partner of the same faith. So you have those shared morals, but then the older that you get and the more that you begin to question those, religious foundations, I definitely experienced the difficulty in the relationship, because at a certain point, naturally in a relationship, it would progress to physical affection and, more from there. And when you're at that age and you believe so firmly in your religious background, it's just like the sky is falling all the time. Like you're like, trying to deal with the thoughts of in one sense, I'm enjoying my relationship, but in the other sense, it's like it's a mirror for everything, and it's telling me that is wrong with myself and my thoughts and my feelings and my actions. And, I have to compartmentalize and put those feelings and stuff away. And especially the thoughts of I must wait until marriage to provide, have this sanctity and stuff. I found for myself later on in life, it's no, you know what? No, I don't really, that's part of it that I don't really vibe with. Was if I'm going to, engage with somebody, I would want to know that, before marriage, if there is, if we're in alignment, is the best way to put it. And I don't know, that's something from the outside, looking in now, especially, from a different vantage point at 28 years old, I can say, that's the right decision to be able to allow yourself the slack to understand if you're compatible before getting legally married to somebody, right? Yeah.
You got people who haven't even made out and getting married over the,
Yeah.
A kiss over the altar is the first thing. Or you get a situation where somebody has to stay away from somebody they're really physically attracted to, and they end up getting married to somebody that they're less physically attracted to. That phenomenon happens all the time.
Oh man. And yeah, I'd imagine that doesn't really foster a good relationship or a good marriage. And
yeah, the person you're attracted to is the one who's dangerous for you, so you avoid them. That happens all the time.
Wow. Man, what a disservice to everybody involved.
Yeah, I know. They say have an eternal perspective, but they don't seem to do anything when horny people in their 20s are wanting to have sex, and that's really driving them to want to get married. And so they marry somebody that they met 2 months ago. They have a really short engagement, and they call it having an eternal perspective. Well, when that's a perfect recipe for people getting divorced. They barely met each other, and they're just horny for each other, and they can't do anything about it unless they get married.
Yeah, and then you find out after the fact, you're like, oh, there's more to life than just that.
Yeah. If you leave,
or you rush in and have kids,
yeah,
your life can change dramatically and drastically at that age.
Mm-hmm.
I think you're pointing out something, that is an observation I have made, that a lot of people that so I'm not LDS, but I did grow up with people that were in the LDS. You see a lot of them, high school sweethearts get married very quickly and have 2 or 3 kids. And I was like, wow, like they went from high school to starting a family. Some of them didn't go to college, and are the stay-at-home moms, and there's nothing wrong with that. But like, I just visualized for me, I'm like, especially now and self-reflecting, I'm like, I'm 28, still figuring life out. And like, here you were 19 years old or 18, and you're like, it's time to get married, dedicating my life to the church, and we're going to be, followers and make it your whole purpose,
What you wear, what you eat, what you drink.
Yeah. This next little segment that we're going to slide into with the religious trauma syndrome, I want to talk a little bit about the scope and the demographics. So we won't spend as long here, but just to kind of understand more of what Joe and I have been talking about, how it kind of applies to the greater picture, right? So we've already talked about that 27 to 33% of U.S. adults experience religious trauma at some point in their lives. 10 to 15% currently suffer from active symptoms. 37% know someone likely suffering from religious trauma. And here's another interesting one. Higher rates of religious trauma syndrome exist among LGBTQ plus individuals, former fundamentalists, and those with childhood religious exposure. Okay. We're going to kind of break down some of these symptoms to see where they lie, right? So of that 27 to 33% of the people that experience religious trauma, we can kind of break down their symptoms, right? Anxiety is about 16.7% of the population which experience RTS. That makes sense. Then you've got 14.5% that say they experience depression. 14.9% experience chronic fear. 13.7% experience shame. And 11.6% experience sleep disturbances. Any of that resonate with you? There's anxiety, depression, chronic fear, shame, and sleep disturbance.
I was actually thinking of let's just take the anxiety. And I was realizing that a person might be an anxious type person, and they're going to be anxious anyway, which is, oversensitive to certain things. Well, the trouble with religion is it tells you it gives you the wrong list of things that you shouldn't be doing, or else it gives you a list of sins that aren't sins. And you think that's why you have your anxiety. It must be because I'm doing this sin or that sin, But if those things aren't sins and you're an anxious type anyway, well, maybe there is something else that's a real thing you should be concerned about, that's making you anxious. But because of the religion, what they teach, you're not looking for the real thing because you realize it's these sins that they've told you, these things you shouldn't be doing that are the bad things. And that must be why you're having anxiety. So you can misprognosticate your anxiety. So,
yeah. And I want to touch on, I'm going to take a moment to tell this story because this person is not here to tell it themselves. Of that depression, 14.5%, right? I was in high school, and knew this person that went to school with me. We were in marching band together all the way freshman year through senior year. And they were religious. They followed the Mormon Church, or more so, I should say, their parents really wanted them to follow the Mormon faith and impressed upon their family that, Mormonism, this is our way of life. There's no questioning it. Like, you are expected to go to church. You're going to follow, what we tell you to do. And this person, he experienced a great amount of depression because of this. And on more than one occasion had attempted to take his life. And in those occasions when he was caught by his parents, his father, I believe, he was kind of taken and directed toward the church, right? That, these feelings that you're feeling, we're going to take them to the church and we're going to pray them away. And, the bishops, they'll make it, better, basically. And I don't know if there was a sense of shame and guilt or what else this young man was dealing with. But I remember vividly going to school one day, and, this is my senior year of high school, and band was first period. And there's a bunch of adults standing at the front of the class. I'm like, well, who are these people? And they tell us, like, everybody sit down. And we were told, hey, this is going to be a very difficult conversation to have, but we wanted to let you know that so-and-so is dead, that he was found in his garage, in his car. He took his own life. Effectively, what had happened was, in the middle of the night, he decided to go into the garage. His parents were still home and they were sleeping, and he turned his car on, and they found him the next day. And this young man was 17 years old. And it was very, very emotionally intense for me, because this person had a relationship with somebody else in my family. And I had to make a phone call. And, they were away. My family member was away at college, and their relationship had already ended for a while. But to make that phone call and just breaking down, trying to explain what was happening. And, I remember we had a candlelight vigil that night, and his father was up there talking, and it just didn't really resonate with me, because he said it took the death of his own son for him to realize that depression was real. And that was just, gut-wrenching. And I went to the funeral, and I was 17, and it was open casket. And, seeing another kid, like, you're not supposed to be 17 and be in a situation like that. And they had his funeral service at the Mormon Church. And I just remember thinking to myself, looking at the young man that was here, his body was there, and just thinking to myself, like, this isn't what he wanted. He didn't want this. He expressed that he didn't want this. And yet he's here. He's here in this environment for who? For the family, for, there was just so much feeling that I had surrounding the death of that person, because religion, I know, played a very central role in his upbringing, and he didn't make it through. And you kind of, I was raised, the phrase that I was told was that is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. And, it just goes to show you, like, audience, that you never know the depths that some people are living through, because, at 17 years old, when this kid is going home and you are, out doing whatever it is that you're doing, they're dealing with this religious pressure and all of the thoughts and the guilt and the shame. And, they try to process it, and they're not accepted by their family. And, some families are not as accepting, like, this is just a phase, son, you believe, you tell me that you don't believe. Oh, we've all been through that phase before, or something like that. And it can be very, very hard to deal with. So I just wanted to share that story, because it definitely, it ties into, what I would assume, religious trauma, that is a traumatic experience to go through. So yeah, that depression is very real. We talked about a little bit at the at-risk demographics. So those that are leaving high-demand religions, so the LDS, Jehovah's Witnesses, evangelical fundamentalism, those individuals with childhood religious trauma, I'll raise my hand, LGBTQ plus people from religious backgrounds, and those deeply committed to the faith before leaving. That's another important point, right? Some of us, we just, when you were raised in an environment where you were told that this is the way that it is and not to question it, maybe you get to a point where you're like, is Santa Claus real? And they're like, oh, darn it, you caught us. Santa isn't real. And then you go, but is Jesus real? And they go, whoa, whoa, whoa. Jesus is real. You can't question that. It becomes very, very confusing.
Yeah, you mentioned the LGBT. This reminds me of someone I know who left, and she realized afterwards, years afterwards, that she was bisexual. But the way it had manifested to her when she was a teenager is she'd, be in a situation where there was girls in the locker room or dressing room or whatever, and she would get, in retrospect, she says, I probably got these flutteries, but I thought that was Satan. And Satan and sex went together, and it was a bad thing. And so it just gave her anxiety whenever there were other girls around in a way that was, attractive like that. And it was only after she'd left the church, she realized, wait a minute, I was bisexual. That was what that was. Because she had an unusual, repulsion with girls. Whereas her sister was like, what's wrong with seeing boobs? You've got boobs. She just didn't, didn't make sense to her sister. But now to her, she's like, oh, that's why, because I liked them. I mean, I like that,
Yeah, so, trying to push it away.
Yeah.
Think about it.
But what a weird way to experience it. She didn't even occur to her that it was a bisexual thing,
Yeah.
So, until later.
Yeah, it's interesting to look back, whenever you have more context and more perspective on your life, to realize, that it's not Satan and not the devil and stuff like that. Because I definitely experienced something like similar in the regard of like you're told like the devil's out there, and he's in those evil thoughts or the temptations and all of that, and you're feeling like you're constantly on the lookout and being like, I gotta fight the good fight. It's very, very much so exhaustive, after a certain period of time. I want to talk a little bit about LDS case studies, particularly surrounding religious trauma syndrome, because the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is pretty well studied in, examples of people that are leaving the church and what happens. But they're particularly, that those studies, they have good examples of high demand religious exits and some unique characteristics that illuminate like some broader patterns here. So a couple statistics, to go over first for context. LDS retention rates have dropped from 95% in the 1980s to 67% today. I'm curious why you think that might be.
I'm surprised it was ever that high. But why do I think that might be? The internet. You find out stuff that you learn stuff about the church, and then you eventually learn that the church knew about this stuff and was hiding, and you were told by your bishops and stuff, oh, that's just anti-Mormon talk. Wait a minute, that stuff's true? So stuff about Joseph Smith and his many wives and stuff like that,
Yeah, I would have to be in agreement with you, not even just like about LDS particularly, but about, I'll say my experience with Christianity, the more questions that you ask, and the less thoughtful answers that you receive, you start seeking more answers. And in the age of information, you can get way diverse perspectives. I also took a religious studies class. It was like my very first college class that I'd ever taken for, I was studying computer science, but I needed to take my different general electives. And the very first class I'd ever went to was religions of the world, and you get to,
I remember that.
Yeah, see and experience the different religions and all of that there. I feel like I'm kind of going on a tangent, lost my train of thought there. But we're talking about retention. The more that you learn, the more you can kind of make that decision for yourself of, am I a follower or not? So a couple more stats, right? About 1/3 of people raised in LDS eventually leave. I don't think that that's a surprising statistic.
No, not at all.
LDS women show significantly higher depression rates, 27% taking antidepressants versus 14.5% of men. Do you think that might be related to...
I think women are a little more, for lack of a better word, no, I didn't want to say the word, but they're well, sorry, clinically, I think they're more prone to neuroticism.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. I can't remember where I read that, but that's a real thing. So but the church is particularly, I think, hard on them as well, because there's just a lot of pressure. You're boxed in, and so that can just create problems. But I'm pretty sure it's a higher rate than it is for women outside the LDS too, right? You were just comparing LDS men to LDS women.
Yes, yeah. I don't have the stats on non-LDS right now.
The one I'd heard is that Utah is has the highest rates of porn and antidepressants use. But
who could say we're surprised?
Yeah. To be honest, I haven't dug into the footnote of that one and verified it for sure, but I've heard it. So
anecdotally, I would say I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah.
Last little statistical bit of context. Mixed faith marriages are increasingly common when one partner leaves. So now we're going to talk about...
I have a friend, when he left, his wife basically wanted a divorce because of that.
Really?
Yeah. Despite him still being a good father and stuff, she just couldn't handle it. And so...
Yeah, I would imagine that puts a lot of strain, especially if one leaves and the other, it might cause them to dig their heels in more and be like...
Yep.
If ever there was a time where I need God, it's now, right?
Yep.
Yeah, that's not surprising. So one of the pieces of study here that kind of came out of taking a look at the LDS and people leaving, they have classified it as the 5-stage exit process, right? And I'm curious how this aligns with your experience, right? So number 1 is the pre-coming out phase. So that's internal questioning and doubt. I would say for myself, that started to happen more so around my teen years, where I'm, learning a little bit more about how the world works and not just kind of accepting like, oh, this is normal all the time. Everybody follows religion and all of that. I'm curious for the pre-coming out, the internal questioning and doubt, maybe when that started for yourself.
Pretty early for me. I was a questioner and a doubter, and would proudly say so. And until I gained my testimony, so to speak, on my mission. And if you brainwash yourself enough times and go on a full-time mission where you're doing it 24/7, about 8 months into it, I knew it was true. So anyway, why did I bring up that?
Because we were talking about when you were first experiencing that internal.
But otherwise, I was kind of proud of my questioning before that. But then even after, I was a little unorthodox in my thinking. And honestly, I was quite open to listen to apostates, people who left the church for years before I left.
Is that...
that's not common, though.
Do they warn against listening to apostates?
Yeah.
Are they kind of deemed as like a threat to the church?
I think a little less now than they used to be. I think because there didn't used to be so many apostates, for people who left. For me, I had a friend who he left after his mission. He got home from his mission and he left the church pretty quick. And he's such a good guy. So he was my example of somebody who can be a good person and leave the church. But otherwise, they're teaching you that's, there's something wrong with someone if they leave the church and stop. Mm-hmm. But this guy was too good a guy for that. And so I think more and more people, even the believers in the church, are probably a little more accepting of people who've left because there's so many who have.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the thoughts that kind of comes to my mind thinking about apostates and people that leave the religion, particularly I've heard is like Jehovah's Witnesses, that, if you are out, you are out, prime example I would say is like Leah Remini
But wait, she was Scientology, right?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, not Jehovah's Witness. My apologies. I'm talking about Scientology, the Church of Scientology. The experiences that I've heard from those that have left, that particular religion.
Yeah, I would say the church does more soft shunning. Mm-hmm. If you put a word to it, the LDS Church does.
That second stage, the first one was that internal questioning and doubt, so the pre-coming out. That would make stage 2 coming out to select others. So sharing your doubts with trusted individuals. So at a certain point, that kettle kind of boils over and you're like, I need to talk about this. Like I can't just journal about it. I can't just keep praying about it. It's, I need to talk to somebody about this.
The friend I said whose wife, when he didn't believe anymore, she wanted a divorce, right?
Mm-hmm.
She called me first when she was worried about, how he was down in the church. I didn't answer. She ends up calling my wife and starts talking to her about it. I learned that, oh my gosh, my friend, he's actually left. Or he doesn't believe anymore. Oh my gosh. So I called him up and said, hey, by the way, me neither, So it was actually really cool to be chatting with each other about that at that point.
Do you feel like having that connection with somebody else that, decided openly that they're, or like opening up, do you feel like sharing that connection made walking away a little bit easier for you?
A little bit, but like I said, I had hung around and was very open to listening to apostates for years before that. So when I finally stopped believing myself, I already knew tons of people I could talk to about it,
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that does make it easier. You can vent. And it's also nice when, I have a sibling who left also. So she felt really good when she learned that I stopped believing and she didn't feel like the black sheep anymore. So, it's nice.
I could definitely see it having an effect on others, kind of this trickle effect of like, well, so-and-so left, that finally gives me the strength to be able to leave. It's like a domino effect.
Yeah.
A little bit until those that are more deeply rooted, they're not going to, they're going to weather this.
There's always going to be those that dig down and entrench themselves. And they can be real jerks, or they can also be really good folks too.
Yeah. So. That third stage of the exit process is exploration. So that's investigating new beliefs and worldviews. So kind of coming to the realization that there is more than meets the eye than what we've been taught to believe.
Yeah.
I'll even say
suddenly a whole world of different beliefs can open up,
Yeah. And I will say, I've met plenty of wonderful people in the LGBT community that, when I think about being raised in a community where, like being gay biblically is considered a sin and unacceptable, seeing that, people in different backgrounds, lesbian people, gay people, bisexual people, non-binary people, trans people, like all of these different people exist in the world and they just want to have the same thing that I do, which is just like to feel respected, that they have a place in the world, that they have a community, and, what I had been raised to believe or what you would like, traditionally think that the Bible says is right and wrong, that comes with its own set of like grieving. I think when you walk away from that, you kind of are like, well, I was made to believe that these people were bad and they're clearly not, or that's generalizing.
Yep.
To just fit the narrative that they want to teach, and I'm not saying that this is every church, but like generally like ask the question, to some people at a church of like, well, what are your thoughts on gay people? You will get a diverse perspective. Some will say, well, religion, marriage is between a man and a woman, and that's what it says. And there's only boys and girls and, black and white. Says and that we're not gonna move forward. And then there are other sides of that where they're more accepting religion or churches that are like kind of embody what you would imagine Christianity would be, which is like this is a place for everybody.
Yeah.
So that kind of causes some internal disputes. I have.
It's amazing, but again, the Pharisees seem to gain the ground a lot. Jesus is fighting against it. And his own church, or his own followers in the future end up being more like the Pharisees than like him.
Yeah, so that's that exploration phase. Then beyond the exploration in the 5-state exit process.
I do want to say about the exploration phase. I think you're right. There's a couple kinds of exploring. There's the kind that, what do I believe? You're finally answering and asking that question. But also now suddenly the things that other people believe don't bother you. Like they might while you're a believer, because if they believe that, then they can't. My belief can't be true, and so
you're talking about cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, or or at least it conflicts with what the church is directly teaching, like gays and stuff. But then you realize, hold on, these people are not that, and yet they're good people. You can be a good person and still be gay or lesbian or ethically non-monogamous or whatever. These people end up being actual good people. And you realize you've been measuring things by the wrong metric,
Yeah.
So it kind of opens you up to what other people can believe too, even if you don't explore it yourself.
Exactly. And I think that that's an important aspect to highlight, is that, you don't have to blanket, say that somebody is right or wrong because they, follow a different sexual path than you do, or, they're ethically non-monogamous, or they're non-binary, or whatever. The acceptance, it should be like a universal thing. I think being a good person that you're saying, like, it doesn't, I've even had this same conversation with other people that are close to me in my life of like I asked, do you think I'm a good person? And they would say, yes. I'm like, well, good, because I think I'm a good person, and yet I'm not religious. I was raised in a very heavily, religious background, and I chose to walk away, but that doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't make me a bad person. Just our lived experiences. You chose to accept it. I chose not to. And then there's that little bit of friction that kind of comes from that.
Right. From something that I always think that these things that we're talking about, LGBT, so on and so forth, these aren't things that Jesus himself mentioned at all anyway. Mm-hmm. It's like he was trying to get you guys to realize what being truly righteous means, which is loving thy neighbor and, being civil, just the simple stuff. And he hated that draconian strictness, and all these rules. And so, along comes a rule, and somehow we think Jesus would be against it. What would Jesus say about that? We didn't say anything about it. So anyway.
Yeah. The final piece, beyond reimagining relationships, which is like navigating the changed family and community dynamics, is identity synthesis. So integrating new identity and meaning-making frameworks. So, for example, right, the belief that, it's a miracle, that, something good has happened in my life. It is a miracle. God always provides, right? Like, that is a framework around your religion that says, when good things happen, good things happen because of my relationship through Christ and my faith in him, and, God will take care, right? And then there is the other perspective, which I tend to share, and I'll even use my experience, right? My audience, I've mentioned, without going into the full story yet, that I have been in a life-altering car accident. And I remember before that life-altering car accident speaking to somebody about religion and how, I was not identifying as religious. And here, I go home and I nearly died. And the amount of people that decided to interject religion into that experience, it was kind of shocking to me. I had people, while my hands were still braced up and stuff, telling me, well, if that doesn't make you believe in God, nothing will. And then you're stuck there kind of thinking, well, what the hell? Like, I didn't even bring this up, or I'm standing in the line at the bank trying to get a notary to sign, my car away so that I can send it to the insurance. And they're like, what prayed so hard for you? And everybody at my church is praying for you. And, speaking as, a non-religious person, when people are saying like, God saved your life, I'm thinking to myself, really? Because it seems like the seatbelt in combination with all of the airbags in my modern vehicle saved me at a high-speed rollover accident. And personally, I think when I'm trying to dig in on the religious trauma, I want my audience to think about what I'm about to say, because, I'm not knocking praying for people, right? But I want others to think about, those of us that do not follow a religion, what prayer means to someone like me, right? You might have just gone through some of the most hard, difficult times of your life, the lowest of the low, and you have to find the strength within you to let this either, melt you, or you can use that, to smelt yourself into a better position. But at the end of the day, you have had to put forth the effort to pull yourself out of that hole and find new meaning and find progress. And then when someone comes along and says, I prayed so hard for you, and look at you've married the right woman, you healed perfectly or whatever. To me, that's like somebody taking credit for all of the shit that I had to go through
for you.
No.
And that got you through it.
And
what about what you did? Yeah.
I've kind of come to the conclusion that when it comes to prayer and people obviously they don't have ill intent when they say I'm going to pray for you. Yeah. But I've come to realize that those that are religious, right, that is their way of trying to process a bad situation. And just to, counter that with, where your good intentions lie, there's the other side of the coin of like, to someone that is not religious, I don't believe that there is a guiding hand behind me that's like, that drunk driver that almost killed Stephen, that's part of his plan, and, this is going to be, a high profile example, but with the attempted assassination of Donald Trump, people like to claim, he's been saved. It was a miracle. And then I counter that with, what about the bullet that went into the man in the audience and killed him in front of his whole family? And then it becomes like a picking and choosing thing. So the prayers and the miracles and stuff like that, I just wanted to touch on that. Not saying that, again, that I'm not saying you're a bad person following religion, but it is something that I just would like to point out for those of us that do not follow religion. You can kind of accept that life has these ups and downs. And from my perspective, the only thing constant is change and stochasticity, randomness. Good things happen to good people. Bad things happen to good people. Good things happen to bad people. Bad things happen to bad people. And there are times when we just don't have control over what happens, but we can control our response to how we react to these things.
Yeah. So, I think there's a point made when people in religion say, pray, thank God. I think they're saying, have gratitude, and I think gratitude in general is a really good idea. People who are ungrateful aren't the happiest people, and they can really handicap themselves in life. So having gratitude is great, but like you said, how about having gratitude for these seatbelts, for your other fortunes that have at least, without religion, you can direct your gratitude to the things that, are really there. Whereas with religion, you're kind of just giving it all to God. It's kind of a lazy way to be thankful in a way.
Yeah. So. Yeah. And I will again touch on, I understand that it comes from a place that is positive and trying to be helpful. But just to kind of point that out for those that might not have thought of the other side of that, as it pertains to religious trauma, because, from my experience, anytime, something like I've gone through a tough period of my life and someone is like, I prayed for you that whole time, or my church was praying for you. And it's like, okay, cool. Thanks. But like,
your mind was on me. That's nice.
Yeah.
Maybe that's.
Yeah.
Now, what I appreciate is if somebody's praying, that they pray for a way to help, that they can help. And then, if they came to me and said, hey, I was praying about a way to help you. And then I thought, hey, maybe I could come over and just ask you what you need. Need any help?
Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah. See,
there's some answered prayers right there,
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah. I think that maybe like that there's a difference between that. Like, hey, I see you're struggling. How can I help you? Like that's a human connection versus I see you're struggling. I just want to let you know that I'm praying for you. And it's like, okay, thanks for the good wishes. You're hoping I pull through, but when I eventually do, it's not the good wishes that got through.
It's always funny. Like, so you're saying God wouldn't have helped me unless you had asked him? Kind of a petty guy,
Yeah, what the hell, dude?
But I will say, there's one thing, a little trick for us agnostics / atheists, of which I am kind of there, is when I think about, there's all this singing in, I like Bach's music, for example. And he's always praising God. He's one of the great Christian composers. And in his one of those religious songs, they could be they're singing glory to God, And I've found a little trick. I'll just add another O and glory to good, because I'm grateful for all that is good. I can sing to that, And so to me, God is what is good. There we go. I can believe in God in that sense. And so,
I think that you're pointing out the singing too. That just triggered a memory for me. I found that when I was going to church, I was less interested in the religion, stories and stuff like that. And I loved the worship services where it was like, hey, I get to sing and, clap around and they're playing instruments. And, I think I learned from a young age that music meant something to me. And, whether it was, in the car or going to a service, seeing live music and stuff like that resonated with me. So if there's one thing I can attest to that religion kind of provided me was knowing, that the music had its place with me.
That's cool.
I want to point out before we kind of tailor into the next segment, we're almost through this, but some unique challenges with the LDS leaving, right? The first one is community integration. So LDS culture deeply is embedded in family and social life, I would say. So like you are going to the church, every week, maybe you've got your events throughout the week. There's seminary for those that are in high school, so they're seeing their friends, their social life is built around the church. So you're
I love going to seminary for the social, especially.
Yeah, no, and I knew plenty of people that went to seminary in their 7th period and stuff. Little fun thing for people to try when you're driving around and you notice a high school, see if you can spot a Mormon church on the corner. There's like either two things, a gas station or a Mormon church. See if you can find those two things close to the high schools. Some more unique challenges, eternal family doctrine. I think that this is one that you might, feel relates to you. Leaving threatens perceived eternal relationships.
Yeah.
That one is core, right? And I think about those that are in my life that still follow religion and that might feel fear or might feel anxiety. And, I think that this is an area of focus that I question, is like, is it the fear of, if he doesn't follow religion and I do, what's going to happen for his his eternal soul? Something like that. Some fear of like, well, now he's going to go to hell because he doesn't believe, and now it's going to be my mission to make sure that he does believe, and it can put strain and stuff on relationships. So just something to be wary of that, this eternal family doctrine kind of is at a part, like a core of it, because your atomic family, in a typical American society, you probably are close with your atomic family, or you try your best to put aside your differences. And if religion is at the core of that atomic family, well, I thought we were always going to be together, and I know particularly the LDS religion has some interesting worldviews on that eternal family. I don't know if you want to touch on.
Well, like I said, my friend, where his wife, wanted to divorce him because, well, now he's not able to take her to the celestial kingdom. She needs to have a man who's going to be worthy to be with her there, after they die. And now that's not there. And so it's kind of what they call sad heaven, where if you're a parent and you have all of your children and none of them are in the church anymore, then you're going to get to go to heaven, but none of your family's going to be there with you. So they call it sad heaven,
Wow.
I mean, ex-Mormons call it sad heaven, I should say. Mormons they just don't see it that way. They're just, no, we need to all be here. But I just feel bad for those parents that when so many of their kids left, when they picture heaven, they're going to picture their kids. And a lot of them, I think, just do picture their kids coming back. That's kind of how they deal with it. So,
yeah.
But then they got to stay vigilant in order for the kids to come back. So
it's nice to know that I'm not the only person that experiences that, that eternal family doctrine. Then there's the geographic concentration. So particularly difficult for people to leave in areas like Utah, where the LDS culture dominates. So that's something important to think about, right? Not everybody can just pick up and move, right? And especially if you love and care about your family, but you don't want to be part of the faith anymore, right? Imagine that your whole social life, your whole town, your everything like that is
business life.
Yeah, and I think that's even the final piece to this was the financial consequences. Career and business relationships are often intertwined with church membership. So if your finances are tied, your business relationships are tied, your social obligations are tied. If you walk away from that and become an apostate, it's like you are an alien in a foreign land.
There can be real financial consequences because your clients can all be LDS, and the minute that you leave, that's why you can have a lot of people who don't even sincerely believe, but they have to do it. They have to stay in it and they have to pretend. Otherwise, their livelihood's gone. And so it's real hard. So.
And that begs the question too, about when it comes to religion. I'm curious your perspective here, Joe. Is religion intended to recruit new people, or is it intended to keep people that are born into it from leaving? And I'm not even just saying like it's religion in general is intended to, but do you find that more people are brought into religion, or people that are born in religion tend to stay? And
I think these days, especially, more people that are born into it staying instead of being recruited. I think 100 years ago, when church was kind of the more of a base of the community, and people believed in more supernatural type stuff, and religion was just part of you were religious, then I can see how people could convert for really sincere reasons, and that's the worldview they have. But I think today we're so secular. I think that it seems, I don't know, I don't want to say it seems foolish for people who are not born into it to convert. I can't fault people. I don't know what's going on in their brains, but for me, I don't. It's so ridiculous in retrospect, that anyway.
Well, now we're going to speak about the psychological mechanisms of the religious trauma. So how does religious trauma differ from other trauma that we can experience? So unlike a single incident trauma, religious trauma involves existential disruption. So that's complete reconstruction of your reality, meaning, and purpose. So the sacred becomes violated, creating unique psychological challenges. Particularly, right, the key mechanisms here, we have our betrayal trauma. So harm from religious authorities and communities, cognitive dissonance, which we've already mentioned, right? Psychological conflict between ingrained beliefs and contradictory evidence, right? Where it doesn't matter, how much fact I put in front of you, if I accept those facts, it would mean that I would have to accept that the foundation upon which my belief system is built is flawed. And that is the cognitive dissonance, where you're like, I cannot choose to accept your facts because it would do harm to me psychologically, is kind of where that is.
Yeah.
And that's a very real thing. Mm-hmm. You get the developmental impact. So early religious trauma can halt normal neurological development, which is interesting.
Yeah.
And then there's that fear conditioning. Repeated exposure to fear-based teachings will create persistent hyper-arousal, where you're in this state of like, I got to be on the lookout. I got to keep these thoughts at bay. I got to keep God, at the center of my worldview. You're constantly trying to keep up with this image that you are supposed to be. And in a sense, maybe it can be considered a form of masking, where it's like, when I'm out and about with my community, I must behave in a certain way that is socially acceptable. I will not swear. I won't, partake in the drink. I won't partake in the smoke, any of those.
I'm going to make sure to look happy because I want other people to know that the church makes me so happy.
Yeah. It'll reflect poorly on the church if you're not happy.
Yeah.
One thing, let's take a look here, that is pretty interesting is called the double bind effect, where religious systems often create impossible situations, inherent sinfulness, requiring impossible perfection, leading to chronic shame and self-criticism that persists long after leaving. And that's like a big thing, I think, that kind of gives us words to what we've been describing, is this double bind effect, right? I must live up to this impossible standard. And if I don't live up to the impossible standard every single day, it'll just wear you down if you let it. So it can be psychologically damaging for people that are trying their best to live up to the standard, but always feeling that sense of failure, consistent failure. Yeah. I know for me, the thought or the feeling has always been, that of never being enough.
Yeah, you're never good enough. Yep, that's the thought that goes through my head. What? I know there's a sin I know there's a sin out there somewhere, that I've been doing.
You got to keep those sins under the microscope.
Every week you take the sacrament, and you're supposed to be worthy to take the sacrament, and so you think about, Now there's one thing, if only once a week it was hey, here's some goals and here's some ways to be better. If only it was that. Mm-hmm. But instead it's a real what do I do? I better repent, And again, when it comes to the really natural, normal stuff, that's going to give you a complex because you're repenting on normal stuff and you're ignoring, and you only have so much bandwidth. So that means you are in fact ignoring other things, that the real source of anxiety, or maybe this is giving you the anxiety. So.
Yeah. And I like that you point out that maybe this is the source of your anxiety.
Yep. The unnecessary source.
So before we tap into our final little act here of our conversation, we are going to talk briefly about identity reconstruction and community loss, because I think that we've already touched a little bit on that, like financial intertwining in your social community, but like, how does one reconstruct their identity? What does that experience look like? So let's touch on what we'll call the identity crisis, right? When religion provides your complete worldview, leaving requires reconstructing your identity through doing, being, becoming, and belonging, right? And this process tends to involve developing new meaning-making frameworks, which we've already touched on, like is it a miracle, or is it just the world, or is it a scientific fact, or whatever? So developing new meaning-making frameworks as part of leaving, rebuilding your moral and ethical foundations, right? You don't have to throw away everything that was ingrained in you, because there's a lot of good that might be ingrained from your religious experience, but, tossing aside the things that no longer serve you from religion, and some of those things that cause anxiety and fear and self-doubts and shame, those cognitive dissonance, pieces that you can kind of lay to rest and go, you know what, like, that's perfectly healthy for me to have these questions. And, if you don't have a justifiable answer, I don't have to accept that. And that's okay. We can agree to disagree. Yeah. But if you still choose to be a follower, cool. But, don't call me an idiot or a stupid person for disagreeing or for just being critical in my thinking, right?
So I don't have to think that way. That's okay.
Yeah.
Suddenly to not have to think that way.
So that was the rebuilding moral and ethical foundations. There is the reconstructing your social identity and relationship. So where are my friendships going to lead, right? As opposed to going to a youth group, maybe you go hit up, do some karaoke on Thursdays at a place, or you join a book club, or go to the gym, or, trying to build your sense of community outside of that of the church. And this is an important piece to highlight to the audience. I think that all human beings, or the vast majority of human beings, we crave connection with one another. I'm somebody that loves my solace and being in my own space, but human beings, we do like to socialize with one another, and we have our sense of community. And I think that all of us just truly want to feel like we have a place where we belong, whether that is for somebody, it is going to church on a Sunday, or going to a club on a Friday, or meeting with your game group, throughout the week or whatever. Like, that sense of community does not have to be tied to religious purpose, I think, is the important highlight there, that we can have our relationships beyond that of, what is expected in the church. And then that identity crisis, last piece there, establishing new sources of purpose and community. So similar to your social identity, if my purpose isn't to praise God or to convert others to this faith or whatever, or to serve my God loyally and faithfully, what does my purpose become? And now you are starting to ask the great question that everybody seems to ask themselves at one point. What is my purpose? And my friend and friends out there in the world, that is up to you to decide. That is one of the beautiful things that life gives you, is the opportunity to decide what it means to pursue purpose. For some, that's art. For some, it's science, culture, there's a vast array of things for you to explore out in the world once you start to search for what purpose means. So
I appreciate a statement Jesus made in the New Testament, and he was quoting the Old Testament when he said this. I think he said, "Hey, doesn't it say in the scriptures that you are gods?" And he's telling these people you're gods. Well, what does he mean by that? And I just like to think that what he means is we have this ability to choose. We're sentient and can choose what to do with our lives, and especially what to believe and what's in our minds. Mm-hmm. That's kind of what I prefer to think of him meaning when he says that.
Yeah. Now, the community loss. We've talked a little bit about this. We'll wrap up the community loss section here just with a little statistic here. 39% of former evangelical Protestants report feeling lonely all or most of the time.
Yeah.
And that's not surprising to me to say that, you feel a certain amount of social isolation, because when you are going to places trying to put on this mask of belief, when you're questioning it, you're trying to not show those cracks to others that are firm believers. Maybe they'll start to notice. And it's not surprising to know that, like, when you're in your own space and you're away from it, you can kind of feel isolated, like you're the black sheep. And you've even mentioned that term before, like, being the black sheep of the family, which is something, I can relate to, that thought of like, I'm different than those that follow, but it's important to remind you that it doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't make you wrong. So that statistic, I think, just shows, you're not alone. If you feel alone, there's others that feel similar.
My wife has repeatedly said that, man, maybe we should go find a church to go to, just for that social life,
Mm-hmm.
And there was a Christian church nearby that was actually pretty good. We've been there a couple times, years ago to try to, because I was always, even as a believer, I would say, hey, let's go to this church or go to a mosque or whatever. We would just to educate my kids and stuff, and But when we went to this one church, they were up there and the guy had a sermon that was like the opposite of what we're taught at church. He was up there and he said, if just because somebody doesn't believe, that doesn't mean they're bad, and the worst thing you can do is tell them that, they don't believe because they don't want to believe. He says, don't judge people like that. It was like this opposite. It was the opposite thing you heard at church. And that was the first time we went there. And so it always left a good taste in my wife's mouth, and there's a place that can offer community. So yeah, we've been tempted to go back to some kind of church.
Well, here's an interesting piece that I'd love your thoughts on too, with the identity reconstruction and community loss. It is the community loss impact that conditional love revelation. So discovery that religious community love was contingent on compliance.
Mm.
And I think that kind of goes back to this concept that we've kind of talked about or touched on of being a social pariah, right? Where maybe, those that are heavily involved in the church and their sense of community has been built around it, that when they leave, they might feel like a social pariah, where it's like, hey, you don't follow this anymore, so we're not going to, really engage in too much conversation, or we're going to distance ourselves from you. That can contribute to that isolation, but it's that feeling that my sense of community love, again, was contingent on compliance. So as long as I'm a devout follower, I have my community there. And then that makes it even, the stakes even higher when you consider leaving, because the longer that you're there, you naturally are, laying roots wherever you go. And, if you have an established sense of community, but you're questioning your faith, and those that are in that community are firm in their faith, imagine the anxiety that builds up thinking of like, well, if I walk away, do I lose my friendships with these people? What does life look like with no community, starting from ground zero? Right.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very scary thought for people leaving a religion. You have that support network collapse I won't touch on that even farther than we already have, but it's like that's your loss of your entire social infrastructure. And that can be devastating to people, especially if you are in a geographic location where religion is the law. Like you look down upon we here in this community, we are firm believers in this faith. And if you don't follow, we reserve the right to judge you, and we will judge you hard, and that if you can't leave that scenario and you're that social pariah in your town, that just sounds like a very stressful, not fun situation to be in. So if you're like in the Bible Belt and you don't follow a religion or you've walked away, I can imagine that you were in a very much more intimidating situation than you would be if you were in like LA and decided to walk away from your religion, or in Oregon, for example.
Luckily, it's getting more popular. Leaving.
So we're getting
Utah.
Oh yeah, it is. It's getting more popular to leave. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can imagine. Probably that darn internet. So before we get to our final piece here on the healing and moving forward, I want to touch on that moral re-anchoring piece, because we have definitely touched on this. The thought of like where my morals develop from. If they're rooted in religion, how do I re-anchor my morals or my worldview post moving forward? Right. Former religious individuals must develop secular ethical frameworks.
Yeah.
They often discover that moral institutions exist independently of the religious authority. And this process tends to involve evaluating previously held beliefs against your personal values, developing internal moral compass, exploring secular humanism and consequentialism or virtue ethics, and maintaining core moral principles while rejecting religious authority. And I mean, that ties exactly into what we had said, which is like, set aside the pieces that no longer serve you, while, you can keep the core pieces that serve as, a good part of your identity, knowing right and wrong. I'm not saying that you should walk away from every belief that you have had, but more so critically analyze the pieces for yourself and choose what to put away if it doesn't serve you. And that takes a while.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that moral re-anchoring side? Maybe if you've had to experience any of that yourself.
Yeah, I think, again, being fairly nuanced before I left, that probably helped me that I didn't really spiral too badly. We know multiple people who left the church and then they just kind of went crazy with the partying and stuff, and end up, hey, it's fine to have a party, but they ended up ignoring their family, because
swing
of the party.
In the other direction, really hard.
So you get people who are so active in the church that they kind of, especially bishops, will get these heavy callings and stuff, and they can end up ignoring their family in that way because they're served, too much time has been spent with the church. Then you get the other way, and you get somebody who goes out and says, "Well, again, we know some people who they decide to go and party their brains out, and they had the means to do it, and again, ignore their family and end up." The consequences are not good. So it is too bad. It's kind of like your whole life you've been getting around on a wheelchair, and then suddenly one day they tell you, you can walk on your own, but you haven't developed the strength to walk.
Yeah.
So your morals are literally swept out from under you because you don't right and wrong come from another source now. So it's pretty scary. But I can safely say that we were very deliberate in any of our choices afterwards to whether. To start trying alcohol or a few other things, but we really were vigilant. And I'd say, so the advice I give is go slow. Don't just drop everything. Just think about things, and you can do what you want, but at least think over them for a while. So
yeah. And that it's totally normal and healthy to, if you're leaving the religion to want to experience new things like the partying and, maybe there's an element of drugs or alcohol or whatever. But yeah, being thoughtful in your approach, knowing that you don't have to do everything all at once. And that pendulum doesn't need to swing from one extreme to the other, that you can take your time. Like life is a process, and the healing and moving forward and experiencing the world is a process. So I think like everything in moderation, right, is probably the advice that I would give whenever you're moving forward, because you'll realize without the framework of religion, that it's like when I get to choose who I want to be and where I want to go, I could be in a situation that I would never be in, if I was a follower of the church, but like, just thinking more for yourself.
And it's not easy sometimes. Again, if your whole life you're raised to think right and wrong or defined a certain way, well, now what's right and wrong now? That's one of the tragic things about religion, I'll say.
Yeah, because then you start getting into like different people believe different things are right and wrong, and it's a gradient, right? And we're trying to approach this from a place of acceptance. So,
and it's in religion, it's pretty shallow, I think, at times. Plenty of atheists will say this. So you mean we wouldn't be nice to your neighbor, except that you're given rewards in the afterlife after you die? You need that to be nice to people, So anyway.
And I think that, the people that are in my life that are still followers of religion, it's like they're not modeling themselves like that because it's like I want to get to heaven or whatever. Like they are just genuinely good people too. So it's
but they often will argue like, well, how do you know what's right and wrong then? They'll say that, So, and I said that, at some point in my belief system. Well, how do you know right and wrong? I was talking to an atheist, and anyway.
Yeah, no, and I think that's you're bringing up like a whole conversation that we could have of like with somebody that is religious. That's just how is your worldview shaped, and digging into what do you believe is right and wrong, and why do you believe those things. I think that's the more interesting aspect, and because you can tap into those of us that have been in religion and left and ask us about our morals and right and wrong without having religion tied to it. Curious as well to those that have never been involved in a religion and how they view right and wrong. But at the end of the day, we're coming from a place of acceptance. It's never, a place where I'm trying to tear down those people with religion. So the final segments here that we're going to talk about, I know that we've been talking for a while, but there's just so much to this. We could probably have multiple episodes talking about religion of all different kinds. But kind of wrapping up our conversation on religious trauma, we want to talk a little bit about healing and moving forward and what that looks like. So I want to touch on some common misconceptions and realities when it comes to religious trauma syndrome. So some myths and realities, and I got 5. So myth number 1, religious trauma only happens to people who leave their faith. The reality is that many experience trauma while remaining within religious communities. Right? You don't want to leave. You're still holding on, right? So important to know that. Myth number 2, only certain religions cause trauma. And the reality is that RTS is documented across diverse faiths, and the structure of the religion matters more than the specific doctrine. So like that environment in which you are raised, or like you mentioned, one church is different than another in the same religion. It depends upon the pastor who is preaching the beliefs, and the audience, which is in attendance, and the geographic location that you're in. That's why religion is such a diverse gradient of perspectives, why subcultures have popped up in religion. And
there also could be you'd almost call them non-religious religions. Huh? Even something like a get-rich-quick kind of scheme, a multi-level marketing thing. That's a very religious community, I think. They kind of have these
numbers.
Beliefs.
Got to crank those numbers, Joe.
Yeah, for one thing. And but also, I think they say that politics and religion are very much the same way in the brain. Well, oftentimes, so is nutrition. They've found that nutrition is kind of treated oftentimes like a religion as well. Like, if you're a really hardcore vegan, or some of the paleo diets, sometimes these behave like religion. So we got to kind of be careful that we can run into that kind of trauma in these organizations that we don't normally think of as religion, because the human brain it's the kind of thing for it,
Yeah. No, it's interesting that you bring up, like politics and religion, because you're thinking about like the broader good, right? Like how do we take care of the collective of people? One is, in a church setting, and, you have your religious authorities versus like a democratic society, and, one person, one vote type of thing. And man, I could go on all kinds of tangents.
Yeah, it's a way. It's something that gives you this. There's a greater good than myself. That's a characteristic of religion.
Mm-hmm.
And the other one is what's the right thing to do, and that's again why nutrition can behave like there's a sin if you eat the wrong thing.
Mm-hmm.
even if it's just bad for you. And so we're looking for ways to measure the world and evaluate it. What's the right thing to do? What's the right decision to make?
Mm-hmm. And then, what is the framework that you're using to determine that?
Mm-hmm.
Myth number 3, if you leave your religion, the trauma goes away. Reality is that trauma requires active healing work, often lasting years after exit. I mean, like this is a concrete example. We're having this conversation now, and Joe and I have left our respective originating religions, and it's been years.
Yeah.
You just you have all of that room in space to think about your experiences, and it requires a certain amount of unpacking, because especially if I find if your worldview has been shaped from a very young age, it's like a ball of yarn where it requires unwinding a little bit, where again, not everything that you have been taught is wrong, but you kind of have to pick and choose, sift through the memories a little bit. And there's bits and pieces that'll leave bad tastes in your mouth. And, knowing what you know now versus when you were a child or when you were very much a firm believer,
it's a relief to not be as judgmental. I'll tell you that. That's such a relief that people can, and it's a relief not to have to make sure the facts fit with the religion. Like, well, that doesn't make sense if I believe in, it could be evolution. You don't need to twist the facts or twist the worldview. You're fine. You don't need to twist anything,
mm-hmm.
to make it fit. You're just like, no, that's what happens, and I don't know the answers to everything.
Mm-hmm.
So it's quite a relief.
Yeah. Walking away doesn't immediately fix the problem.
Another way, I could be completely healed. But just a few nights ago, I come home and my daughter's crying. She's 14, and she's crying because one of her friends told her that she's the reason why she's not allowed to spend the night at our house is because we drink. And we actually at that time, had no alcohol in the house. And if we do, it's like one Mike's lemonade or something. That's it. But her parents just see us as these parents people who've left the church, and so we drink, and so can't spend the night at their house. And I calmed her down. I said, "Listen, they were taught that. They were taught to be afraid, and she's just kind of she's trying to be protective, And we're actually much more protective of our daughter when it comes to darn technology, So we're much more strict than they are. But what they're worried about is that we might drink in front of them, and we don't have enough alcohol to look, Again, we had none at the time.
That's so interesting to hear that. Yeah, you can't spend the night over there anymore because we don't want that influence. And wow, what an interesting. Yeah, no, that's definitely
the consequences echo. And how would they have felt if we were never LDS? I don't know. They might. I don't know if they'd trust us less or more. So
yeah, no, that's an interesting question. Myth number 4 of 5. Religious trauma is just anger at God or rebellion. The reality is that RTS involves legitimate psychological trauma symptoms requiring professional treatment. And again, all of these links are going to be in the show notes. So the audience, you are definitely recommended to take a look for yourself. But I find that that's an interesting one. Because
I think that that's another thing that local Christian pastor, or his sermon, what he said was, he goes, don't think that people are disbelieving means that they're angry with God. That's another thing he said, not to believe that's why,
Yeah.
So
yeah, no, and
I'm agreeing with you.
Yeah, it's definitely, I wouldn't find myself angry at a God or anything like that, but I do question, what type of God facilitates maybe the world, like if you the world that you're talking about, because just like all the good you say is brought about by God, then that would mean that there's also bad in the world. And I mean, your view could be that, well, all bad is Satan and all good is God. But
I always think about the poor little girl in East Asia who's born and is a prostitute by the time she's 10 years old. I think, where was the blessing? Who's praying for that girl? You know, every time somebody might say, well, God's blessing you. I'm like, yeah, great. I get this. I get some extra cash or something. And this girl's born in that kind of environment. So it makes sense. Honestly, if there is a God, well, he is kind of a jackass, you know. Yeah. That makes sense, you know. I mean, I had Christopher Hitchens said, he said, well, if you were brought before God, what would you want to say to him, you know? And he just goes, how dare you? That's what he wants to say to God. How dare you? And it's understandable. Come on, there's enough suffering. So, but I don't. Yeah, they're going to find an excuse for you to leave. That's just the nature of it. You know, you can't just leave because you don't believe it.
Yeah. And I think that's an interesting thing to point out is, you know, those that remain, they have to contextualize for themselves and process, well, so-and-so is leaving, so it must be a them problem. It's not a problem with the religion because, you know, again, you get that cognitive dissonance. The more that I accept the reality of the situation and the facts at hand, the more that my world kind of falls beneath me and I have to pick up the pieces. And it is a very overwhelming process. That last myth that we have here is that recovery means becoming atheist or anti-religious. And I think that this is a prime example, right? Like our conversation right now, the reality, recovery goals vary. Some reconstruct faith healthily. Others find different spiritual practices. Some choose secular paths. So that might mean, you know, instead of going to church, maybe I'm practicing, you know, meditation and, you know, breathing and, you know, I find grounding there. Others, maybe you jump from one religion to another, you know, maybe you find your sense in your community. But you don't necessarily have to become anti-religious, which, you know, I feel like I embody that, where it's like, I am not opposed to anybody following their own religion. But I think it is important to be able to at least have dialogue about how religion shapes us as people, because you and I have both had our own unique experiences. And, you know, I think it's important that given the option, right, that people know that leaving a religion is an option and it doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't mean that everything you've ever been taught is bullshit. It's healthy to be able to question things and look at things critically. So I'll point that out before we get to this.
You know, I have to say C.S. Lewis, you know, you familiar with C.S. Lewis?
I've heard of C.S. Lewis.
He wrote The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. He was an atheist until Tolkien converted him, helped convert him to Christianity, and he became this Christian philosopher. Wrote Mere Christianity, which is a pretty good Christian apologetics book. But he said that somebody who's questioning, I'll paraphrase it. He said somebody who's questioning God's existence for the first time in their life is probably closer to God in that moment than somebody who'd never questioned it. Because they're using their full intellect.
Yeah.
You know, and if he comes to this, you know, this conclusion or that conclusion, at least he's getting himself there. So, you know, I always love that quote from C.S. Lewis. He's one of my favorites. As far as Christians go, oh my gosh, he's great.
I've never heard that. That is a very interesting quote. We're getting to the very end now, and I want to touch on some evidence-based recovery approaches before we kind of summarize the conversation that we've kind of been guided through here, and wrapping this thing up. So we got some primary therapeutic modalities that have been pointed out. That's a mouthful of words. So different therapy, right? You've got trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy that you can utilize. That's the most widely recommended first line of treatment as cognitive behavioral therapy with professional. You have EMDR, particularly effective for processing traumatic religious memories. Remind me, I think, is EMDR, that's electromagnetic? Or
no, it's the one where they do the eye movement.
Oh, okay.
Which I've had. So
interesting.
And I will say it does work. It took a while to kind of really realize how it worked, but it makes a lot of sense. It tends to make traumatic memories that you have not as traumatizing.
Can you explain how it works?
Well, you kind of find a core memory, so to speak, you know, to phrase in and out, right? Inside Out, the movie. Mm-hmm. you find a kind of a core belief or a core memory that maybe is scarring, and that you think about, and you might always be ruminating over, And what they do is this strange simple technique is you have there's a couple ways you can have these two buzzers in your between your fingers of both hands, that it buzzes bzz, 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 left, right, and what it does is it kind of helps. Why it works, they probably don't know, but they do know that it helps people somehow. And then as you're thinking about that memory, it somehow just distracts you and kind of trains your brain to not be so bothered by it. And another thing they do is they'll move a light back and forth. So your eyes have to follow this light back and forth
while you're thinking about it.
Yeah. And I've done it, and it's worked. But I needed a lot more help in a lot of other areas rather than just bad memories. But it's very helpful in making those not sting as much. So specific memories. Yeah.
I've never heard of that. Yeah. Wow.
And that's the MDR.
There's somatic therapy, so addresses trauma stored in the body. You have group therapy, which I could see that being very helpful. So it's essential for community rebuilding. I mean, what better place to build a community than people that would understand where you're coming from? So group therapy would be great. Specialized approaches. There is betrayal trauma therapy. I haven't heard of that. Some grief work and attachment-based therapy. There are actually a couple of different specialized recovery organizations that exist, if you've never heard of them. I mentioned them at the beginning. There's the Religious Trauma Institute, so that is got clinical training and consultation. There is the Reclamation Collective, which is virtual support groups worldwide. We've got Recovering from Religion, which is a helpline for local support groups. And then there is Secular Therapy Project, which connects individuals with non-religious therapists. And then we've got our self-care strategies, right? So when we need to take care of ourselves. So let's talk very briefly about some self-care strategies. There's mindfulness and grounding, which I think we've already kind of mentioned. That's secular practices for anxiety management. So kind of going back to your breathing, taking deep breaths and being more in the moment, focusing on you. Yeah. Is a good coping strategy in general. There's that physical self-care, exercise, nutrition, sleep for your nervous system healing. I think people underestimate the effect of, physical exercise. And I've even told people this, where it's like, if you don't do some form of resistance training, your body's going to have difficulty holding itself up. And if you're constantly aching all the time, it's going to affect your sleep. It's going to affect the way that you your cognitive processing power, the bandwidth that you have. One of the simplest things that you can do is a form of physical exercise, not just cardio, but some form of resistance training over time will definitely impact your mental health. There's the journaling, right? So processing your emotions and tracking healing progress. It can be difficult, especially with those that have ADHD. I'll speak for myself there. Task avoidance is very real, and sometimes sitting down and writing your thoughts, could be slower, or you don't really want to do it. So maybe speaking in front of a microphone, or like we're doing right now. I've found as well, doing what I would call a stream of consciousness is also beneficial. So setting your phone down and recording a vocal note for 5 or 10 minutes, just being able to speak about how you're feeling, just getting that out in some way, shape, or form is very healing. Even if you don't listen to it, just not being so trapped in your brain is very good self-care.
I called my mom the other day, and things have definitely cooled a bit because we left the church, but also for other reasons. But I just called her up the other day, and I just walked around my house and talked to her for 20, 30 minutes. I used to call her all the time. And I found that I felt better. It didn't matter what I talked to her about, but it's nice to have. It makes total sense that talking to my mother and just talking to her about things that are going on, things that I might be frustrated at, no church stuff, it's amazing that was very helpful. Just to talking to her, just a little bit of venting,
Yeah.
So
it's almost kind of similar to body doubling. I think you and I have had personal conversation about somebody that's physically there, for some reason, like you could feel like you're more productive or less likely to get distracted, even if you're not working on the same thing.
We are meant to work with other people. It's just how we are.
Yeah. The last two things for the self-care strategies would be boundary setting, which, learning to protect your time and energy. Right. I think that that's incredibly important, especially if there are those that you still wish to maintain a relationship with that follow religion. Establishing proper boundaries is important for both sides. So you obviously want to respect their boundaries as a religious person, but they should also try to respect your communicated boundaries if there are different triggers that exist. So opening up about your thoughts and your feelings about religion with that person and just saying like, hey, I am dealing with certain triggers, or when we talk about, if you mentioned that you've prayed for me and stuff, maybe that might be a little bit triggering. So if in the future, could you just, ask me if there's anything that you could do for me that would work better for me, right? Like that's communicating to that other person that you can still serve a place in my life, but like, let's not form that relationship on the basis of religion, right? And then there's their community building, connecting with other survivors and supporting communities. I think it's interesting that they say survivors, but like connecting with those that have shared experiences is very helpful. And one of the best ways to do that is to just get out and about in the world. The more that I am out and interact with people and just learn about their background, you'd be surprised how many people have been a part of a religion and walked away and have felt the same feelings that you have felt, or maybe similar feelings along a different vein. But there are absolutely other people in the world that deal with the same pressures that you might be feeling with or dealing with when it comes to leaving a religion. So building a community where you're not isolated is an important part of that process.
There is quite an ex-Mormon community, again, which I knew about before I myself had left. But I will point out the negative side to it. Okay. Well, for one thing, there's somebody's phrase, bitches and liars in the church and out of the church. Okay. Don't think that, you can run into the same kind of things, that people are backstabby or even gossiping behind your back and stuff. Or suddenly, there's a new normal now that people are enforcing a natural social, norms that are now the ex-Mormons say you have to be this, instead of the Mormon way, it's now the ex-Mormon way, They say there's this phrase that somebody said in the ex-Mormon community, there's Mormons, and then there's ex-Mormons, and then there's, I don't really care. And you moved on. You're like, you're neither, because now you're just me, I think there's another way to phrase that, but one of the the negative side of this is sometimes you can get yourself into a complaint frenzy, and somebody says, oh, my bishop did this. Your bishop's an idiot. It's like, dude, it's the religion that you should be complaining. The bishop was doing what he thought was right and what the religion taught him. But then it turns into this complaining about individual people that you don't even know that somebody's venting about. And I understand there's a place for it. You kind of want to sometimes spill your beans and say, God, I'm so frustrated by this, and very understandable. And you're there and you get empathy, but sometimes it can turn into too much of everybody's bitching and just bitching all day long, and you stay there too long and it's counterproductive. So at a certain point it takes more action and less bitching. You got to move on. It's pretty soon you're getting too obsessed with it. You can end up complaining about individuals who are still in that system who are just like you. So be careful about judging them so harshly, because you were them. So.
Yeah. Well, we've been talking for nearly 2 hours. I've got this final section here to kind of help us conclude. So we're going to tie together some of the key takeaways for our listeners. We'll again touch on those resources for some immediate support, and then I'll send us off with the final message here. So our key takeaways for all of our listeners here today. Number one is that religious trauma is real and it is treatable. It's not spiritual weakness or rebellion. That recovery is possible. So with appropriate support, treatment, you are able to heal from walking away from a religion if you're experiencing religious trauma syndrome. Number 3, community matters. Connection with others who understand is crucial. And I mean, part of our dialogue today is that for myself, speaking with somebody else that has been involved in walking away from religion, you help just understand yourself a little bit deeper, and get through another layer of that onion. Number 4, that professional help is available. I think that this is incredibly important to touch on, that trauma-informed therapists specialize in religious trauma. You can find therapists that are not religious but specialize in religious trauma syndrome, even though it is not a designated DSM-5 diagnosis. But know when to bring in external help, right? Like that we were talking about, like to a certain degree, quote, bitching is only going to get you so far. I think that, that is where you bring in external counseling, somebody that is a non-biased third party that can listen to your experiences over an extended period of time and be that voice of reason to just point out your patterns and your thoughts and help you process over time. And number 5, that recovery is individual, right? So there is no right way to heal or a prescribed outcome. So you're not going to be following listeners, if you stick to this dedicated path, you too can, leave and abandon your religion. Where we understand that it's very, very much an individual process, and you all have your own context. You could be in a very, very different geographic part of the world where it's like, that community is your town, it's your everything. Maybe you're financially tied to it, or maybe, this podcast is giving you the tools to have conversations with others that are in your shared circle and thinking about it, right? I want to touch on our resources that we found for some immediate support. So number 1 for our audience is the crisis resource of the National Suicide Prevention Line, right? It's 988. Is that National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. We have the crisis text line, so you can text HOME, that's HOME, to 741741. If you are in need of some help, you can text them out. And then special resource here for us is the LGBTQ National Hotline. That's 1-888-843. Let's try that again. 1-888-843-4564. We've got some specialized organizations that we've talked about. That's the Religious Trauma Institute. You can reach them at religiostraumainstitute.com. There is the Recovering from Religion. You can access them at recoveringfromreligion.org. And the Reclamation Collective. You can reach them at reclamationcollective.org. And as far as finding professional help, right, there is the Secular Therapy Project Therapist Directory that you can look up, the Religious Trauma Informed Clinician Directory that you can look up, and the American Psychological Association Therapist Locator. So those are all resources that you can utilize if you are trying to locate a counselor that might be able to help you overcome your religious trauma syndrome. So our final message that I kind of want to leave the audience with here after about 2 hours of conversation is this. To those listening who see themselves in these stories, you are not broken. You are not alone. Your experience is valid, your pain is real, and your healing is possible. The journey from religious trauma to recovery is not easy, but it is one that thousands have walked before you and thousands more will walk alongside you. So it's important that I let our audience know you are not alone in your journey. So I want to thank my guest, Joe, for being brave enough to speak about his experience leaving the LDS church. And particularly for sharing in such a sensitive subject. This is one of the first episodes, I think, that kind of touches a little bit more deeply on some sensitive topics for the world. So I hope that this conversation was engaging for you, audience, that maybe you learned something new or made you think in a different way. Whether you are religious or not, I think, again, what I've tried to touch on is that we all have our own individualized lived experiences that shape the world and our worldview of how we view things. So everything we've spoken about today is just in an effort to inform and to seek to understand, not seeking to judge. So any of my followers here that are religious and follow a religion, thank you so much for listening in, and hope today kind of gave you a different perspective on those that are on the other side of the coin that have chosen to walk away from faith. So,
all right. Thank you, Stephen. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Anything that you would like to say for the audience to remember to take away, or
gratitude? It's good to be grateful for the good things in life, even though you may be going through a tough time. I'm going through a tough time, but again, gratitude I think is a really healthy way to live. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, hopefully we will be hearing more from Joe in the future. I think that we're going to be discussing some possible projects that we might be able to work together on, but there's plenty more conversations to be had out there in the world on plenty more topics. So if you have any topics that you would like to know about, research further or hear about, let me know in the comments below. If this jived with you, let me know what I did good. Let me know what you hated. Like it if you like it, dislike it if you don't. Thank you everybody for joining me. Once again, I am just some dude on the internet, and this has been another episode of Just Some Podcast. Thank you very much.
Hey.